All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session for Raw Talks Podcast Festival. As Jesse mentioned, um, me and Nathan are going to be talking about funding opportunities and creating a podcast budget. Nathan will be talking about the budgeting portion of this session, but I'm going to be talking about, how you might go about funding your podcast. Now, let's start off with, I guess, the main question that some of you might have on your mind is, how has Raw Talk actually been funded? Well, with regards to how Raw Talk's been supported, we have sort of two main pillars of support. The first is the sort of internal support that's been going on at the University of Toronto. And you can see that on your left with our home department, the Institute of Medical Science, as well as some graduate education offices such as the School of Graduate Studies and the Graduate and Life Sciences Education Office, which is something I'll get into a little bit later on. We've also been very fortunate in having a lot of external support from different organizations outside the University of Toronto. And you can see that with the examples on your right, with Johnson& and Johnson, the innovation labs from them, the Gardner Foundation, among other awards which stem from support from TD Insurance and MBNA. So in my talk, I'm really going to sort of just give an overview of how you might go about either starting out your podcast and then getting in sort of institutional support, as well as looking for places to sort of find those external funding and sponsorship sources. I do want to add the caveat that I am giving this talk with the perspective of a sort of a person very closely associated with the university. So, but I think that there are some tips and pieces of advice that anyone can really take forward with regards to looking for sponsorship. All right, so let's talking about starting your podcast and basically what kind of money you'll have to start off with. And even in the case of Raw Talk for season one, it started off with a self-funding sort of venture. As Richie mentioned yesterday, when they started out, they really had sort of a lot more simpler equipment in comparison to some of the equipment that even Alex showed off, where you can see that the primary piece of recording equipment was in fact a microphone attached to a pen clip. And it really sort of just shows to highlight that you can really just start simply with regards to how much you're actually going to invest with your self-funding. Now, one thing to note though is that about 5 years ago, there weren't nearly as many student podcasts present in the community. So in order to really get Raw Talk up and running, the founders and the grander team itself had to give proof of concept to the department in order to show why their podcast had value. Now, moving on to actually getting to the point where you might want to talk to your institution about getting support, this is sort of where we kind of need to look at how the general structure of funding might appear from a given university. So let's talk about the example of the University of Toronto. Here we have the Faculty of Medicine, which is where we're based of, and let's say two separate offices where you can start to look for contacts or people or committees which might give you some sort of funding support. On one hand, we have the Graduate and Life Sciences Education Office, which is a office particularly focused to improving or you know, really improving or excelling uh, graduate education in the life sciences. And separate for that is the home department of our particular podcast, the IMS, as I mentioned earlier. And internal to that home department is this internal funding committee known as SAFE. And it's really from SAFE that we get some of our basic operational funds from with regards to how Raw Talk is run each year. Now, if we were to sort of extrapolate this to any external university, we might sort of take this kind of approach where you want to look at contacts in a given faculty which might be closely associated to the topics that your podcast is broaching. And in that faculty, or perhaps even at the grander university level in general, there might be another separate graduate education office where you can start poking around for support. Now, of course, again, when you're looking at the faculty level, you can then dive down into the departmental level to start looking for as to who maybe sits on that internal funding committee and what maybe if they have their own awards themselves. So this is really the sort of general hierarchy with regards to where to look for help in a university if you so wish to do that. Now, going back to the example of Raw Talk, once they were able to show that, yes, Raw Talk is a successful and impactful podcast that people are listening to, something that the team had to do in order to gain that institutional support from the SAFE committee is that they had to pitch the podcast. So I wanted to take some time to show you why, or at least how you can effectively pitch your podcast with various tips and tricks. So those tips and tricks are highlighted on the slide before you. And we'll just go through these one by one with my additional comments on each of them. So the first one that we want to talk about is that you have to make sure that you have a clear vision and mission. What is your show about? Who is it for? And what kind of value does it have for the listener? If you're a new show, what kind of production expertise do you have? Who's on your team? What skills can you do? And what kind of help do you need if you're lacking in any of those needed skills to produce a podcast? If you're an existing show, you should really know what kind of impact your listenership has, what kind of impact you've had to date. And this relates really well to what Atifa and Allison and Iman were talking to about earlier with regards to the sort of analytics that you can get with regards to social media, or perhaps even what Jesse just showed with Google Analytics on the website. And these are really important to show to any potential sponsor that yes, you are in fact reaching an audience who's listening consistently. You want to make sure that you are direct about what you're asking for. This is something I'll touch on. That's something I'll touch on, as well as Nathan will a little bit later on, with regards to knowing the exact line items and the amounts that they cost. You want to research your potential sponsors. Really know who you're going to be talking to in these kinds of either committees or contacts, because they could be studying or they could be doing something completely different than what your podcast is about, but you need to get their attention in order for them to give them their vote to support you. And last but not least is that you need to know the significance of your podcast to the sponsor. You know, what do they get out of it by supporting you and your podcast? Now, with regards to external funding, so we're going to shift gears here a little bit. Where do you want to look for these kinds of awards or other sponsorships? Well, in the example of Raw Talk, at least, places that have really worked out for us are, what to start off with, our local student centers. And although that seems like it would fall under the internal funding sort of bracket that I've set out here, I consider local student centers to be kind of separate, because sometimes they have awards which are strictly given out from that organization. So our example here is from the University of Toronto Graduate Student Union, where they have given us some, I believe, financial awards to support some live events. In addition to that is also the alumni office. Alumni for a university, at least at the University of Toronto, are very interested in knowing what's happening in the present community and just seeing what's up from the school that they graduated with. And the example related to that is our present sponsors, including for this festival itself, MBNA and TD Insurance through the Pillar sponsorship. Now, a third example that's worked out really well for us are local business and innovation hubs. Typically, if you can find an organization which sort of shares a similar interest, you might be able to work out some sort of agreement which can lend with which they can lend their support for you. Now, I do want to take a moment here and sort of give a clarification that funding, or at least sponsorship, is not necessarily the same as getting money from an organization. It can be a lot of other things to support the ventures that your podcast is having. So, for example, and Richie mentioned this earlier yesterday. Richie mentioned this yesterday. With Johnson & Johnson, they've been able to provide us with event spaces for our live events, for two of our live events in the past. Another example of this is the company Muse. They provided us headphones with which we are able to use as a raffling item in order to get guests to complete a survey, if I understand that correctly. So again, funding can really come from the money, but sponsorship can come in many different forms. So always keep that in mind when you are looking for these kinds of opportunities to collaborate. Now, I did give that clarification, but sometimes for sort of these, you do in fact need to write fellowship applications. And I'm going to sort of dive into this a little bit further and talk about just sort of general advice that I would give with regards to giving, or at least writing, an application like this. So I'm going to have various ideas on the screen, but I'm only going to highlight a few which are underlined. And the first I'm going to show, or at least really specify, is that you want to write these applications in an active voice. I don't really have a strict definition for passive or active voice, but when you read it, you can really tell the difference. So I'm going to read the examples that you see on the slide. So first, the car was driven off the road by Sally. Timmy was bitten on the arm by the dog. And then when you compare, and sorry, those are the passive voice examples. And when you compare them to the active voice examples, Sally drove her car off the road. The dog bit Timmy on the arm. You can sort of really feel the impetus and difference in momentum that each sentence sort of takes on. And when you're reading this in an application, this is really what gets the attention of the reader, and it really just engages them because in any given situation they're reading tens of applications like yours, and you really want to grab them by the collar if you can. Now, On a similar note to that is that when you're writing these applications, you want to write in a very strong and evocative language. This is a moment where your thesaurus really becomes your best friend. And you want to make sure that you're not just using, for lack of better terms, sort of simpler terms to describe what you're doing. So the examples that I've given you on the screen are ones that I've pulled from applications we wrote this year. So for one event, which is going to be focused on climate change, we wrote, this year we return to the climate crisis, which continues to pose a major threat to global health and stability. And, keep in mind that this is not just, but this is an event for a podcast that we're running, but we're including a sentence like this to sort of give, action and initiative to what we're doing. But of course, there's a lot more positive examples, such as our event will empower recent alumni to develop meaningful projects. Our podcast enriches the student experience. So it's a little bit, it's like a step above saying, we have a lot of fun and we make the community a little bit better. This is how we can really sort of help the community grow, by saying you enrich something. Now, again, sort of touching on the idea that you need to be direct about your asks. And also, I forgot one last point now about writing fellowship applications, is that all the advice about pitching your podcast also applies to writing the fellowship applications. So sort of keep those two hand in hand. Now, going back to the point about being direct about your asks, you really need to be aware of the specific costs each line item will have, because they will add up very quickly. I won't go through every single one of these examples here, but as you can see, they can really pile up. And again, Nathan will talk about this in his portion of the talk as well. So with that, I think I'd like to just wrap up by saying, don't be intimidated to reach out to potential sponsors or to apply to things. Even if you don't get it or your email just gets ignored, there's not really anything lost, because, well, you never really had it in the first place. But if they do say yes, then, you have a really great opportunity to work with someone, and, things can get rolling from there. And of course, the only way to get really good at either building collaborations and contacting potential sponsors, or even just writing those kinds of applications, is to make sure that you just keep doing it. Practice really does make perfect in this case. And more often than not, you can really sort of recycle some parts of the application as well. So it does get easier over time. Lastly, if you want to hear a lot more about this, there are some things that we didn't really talk about that we could further discuss. You can join me in a brainstorming session later on, and we can talk more about funding your podcast. And with that, I just wanted to say good luck to everyone. And you know what, Nathan, I'll let you take it away from here.
Alrighty, so here we are. I'm taking over this little bit on creating a podcast budget, aka Finance 101, aka the financial literacy class that your high school forgot to teach you. I need to put out a huge disclaimer though. Nothing here is financial, tax, or legal advice. You should talk to a professional if you actually need that. Very good. All right, so we're going to cover three things. The first two we're actually going to cover now, and the last one we're going to cover in the workshop. So the first one is a case study introduction. Then we're going to go through a little bit of what financial statements look like. I would also advise you to follow along with these slides. There's a lot of text on these slides. Unfortunately, that's how finance works. You have to use numbers. You have to look at tables. It's just how the cookie crumbles. Great. So let's move on. So whoops. Whoa, we skipped forward there. All right. There we go. So our case study here is you're a new podcast and you'd like to receive an educational grant, for example, like from your fellowship or something like that. You'd also like to purchase some recording equipment and pay for a podcast distributor or other online services. The two other things that we will talk about in the workshop is also receiving income from advertising and receiving a startup loan. You can also work through these on your own, of course, if you want to go through and pick up the slides on your own, tinyurl.com/rtpodcastfinance. Cool. So setting up your financial statements. Why we do this is because it helps you understand how to keep track of your money, demonstrate to funding sources that you can actually manage your money, and to also present a convincing story to justify your financial needs. So your financial statements have three parts. The first part is your balance sheet, which provides a snapshot of your overall financial state at a specific point in time. So it's like one date. It involves a couple of terms that we'll talk about later. The income statement describes how funds have been earned or spent over a period of time. And the cash flow statement describes how cash has moved over a period of time. Great. So step one, the balance sheet. And what is in your balance sheet? Well, the balance sheet provides you, again, a snapshot of your overall financial state at one specific point in time. It involves three things that are really important: equity, assets, and liabilities. Equity is what you're actually worth at the end of the day, and it's computed by subtracting assets from liabilities. Assets is anything of value you own. This could be the cash in your bank account, the value of the equipment that you own, your recording equipment, the microphones, etc., as well as something important here, funds that you anticipate receiving. So like funds, for example, a grant hasn't given you all the money that you want to get. They give you half of it now and they give you half later. Well, the other half that doesn't come to you right away, that's accounts receivable. The other side of this is your liabilities or debts that you owe. So this could be credit card debt, bank loans, or funds that you anticipate sending. So for example, you know you're going to have to pay out $20 for your Blueberry podcast distributor. You haven't done that yet. That's part of your accounts payable. Cool. So back to our example here. Oh, shoot. I need to not do that. There we go. Back to our example here. The balance sheet, So notice that the balance sheet here has terms like, doesn't have terms like revenues or expenses. These will come up later. That's okay. But its focus here is really telling you about what you have, what you owe, and what you're worth. So on January 1st of this year, in our little example here, you have no money. You've just started out. But you're lucky. You receive an educational grant and you applied for $1,000. You get your $1,000. And like a lot of granting agencies, you get $500 on the day that they approve your grant or approve your application, and you'll get the other $500 6 months later, say July 1st. Great. So you'll notice here you have $500 in your cash bank account. You have $500 in your accounts receivable, which is your asset, and those two together are your assets. And you have nothing in your accounts payable. You don't owe anyone anything yet. Your overall equity, what you're worth, is $1,000. Great. So step 2, the income statement. The income statement describes how funds have been earned or spent over a period of time. So this is talking about money coming in and out of your organization. It involves two big terms: revenues and expenses. Revenues includes funds you receive. So these are things like your grants, or for example, advertising sales, merchandise sales. On the other side of this, you have your expenses. And we're going to talk about CAPEX later. But first, operating expenses, or OPEX, is costs that you incur to do business. So these are things like your annual cloud storage fees or monthly bank fees, consumable office supplies or loan interest. The other side of this is CAPEX. These are funds that you also spend, but these are funds that you spend on long-term physical assets that you'll actually own. So for example, recording equipment or computers or even real estate, if you're lucky enough to have that as a podcast. They usually only occur once or maybe once every several years. And we'll talk about why CAPEX is not technically part of expenses in part 4 of this section later. But back to our example here. So you and your team meet up and you decide to make some purchases, and you have your $1,000 in revenue. You get half on January 2nd and the other half on July 1st. And the other side of it is OPEX, which is the expenses that you'll eventually incur. And for example, in our toy example here, we have cloud storage fees for $25 a month and podcast distributor fees for $20 a month. So this in total is $45 a month that you have to pay to run your podcast, and that's paid at the end of the month, every month. CAPEX, again, we'll come back to this. But again, just to re-emphasize, you saw the slide earlier, you'll incur more costs than you think you will actually incur. So in this case here, we're doing a very, very, very small toy example, but just note that there are a lot of other things you might be spending on, things like domain name fees, or transcription service fees, or rent for a physical space if you actually need that. So just keep that in mind. Great, so back to our example here. Our income statement has, again, our revenue and our expenses. Our revenue here is that $1,000 that we receive, and our expenses here is $25 in our cloud storage fees and $20 in our podcast distributor fees. So as a result of this, your revenues minus expenses gives you your net income. And that is $955 for the month of January 2021. Just as a heads up, net income is called net loss when negative. And that's important because you'll notice here that, again, our income statement is defined for a period of time. In this case, we're doing monthly income statements. On the January side here, you see that 955 again, 1,000 minus 45. But on the February side, you don't expect to receive any money. So you actually have a net loss of $45. As a quick note as well, when you see numbers inside brackets like that, that means that the number is negative. Great. So back to our example. You're a podcast, you have cash to spend and you have bills to pay, but how are you going to record your episodes? Your team asks you for some nice recording equipment, and it's going to cost you $750 as a one-time cost. Now, what is the difference between your OPEX and your CAPEX, your expenses versus your capital expenditures? The important difference here is that although both of these involve spending money, your OPEX involves funds that leave your organization. So that means your equity decreases. What your worth goes down when you pay for your OPEX. On the other side is your CAPEX. These are assets. CAPEX is considered an asset because you retain the value of the physical assets you own. When you buy a $600 recording device, you're still worth that $600 that you spent it for. So as a result of this, your equity doesn't change when you pay for CAPEX, and your CAPEX is part of your balance sheet. As a quick heads up, though, you may want to consider something called depreciation, but we won't talk about it here. That's probably like Finance 201. So come chat with me maybe in the finance workshop for that stuff. Great. So the last part here then is our balance sheet. Let's go back to our balance sheet and recall this is defined for a specific date. So in this case, this is January 2nd. You and your team decided that you're going to have to pay out $45 in January at the end of the month, at least, to pay for your cloud service fees and whatever else. And so as a result of this, you have $500 still in your cash account, $500 in your accounts receivable, subtracting 45. Again, your equity here is $955. That's how much you're worth. You'll notice, though, you have a big problem. If you just look at the cash that you have $500 in cash, but you can't actually afford the equipment that your team wants. That's $750 worth of equipment. You don't have the money. So last step here is our cash flow statement. I'll just go back quickly here and just make one point very clear. If you looked at the bottom of the balance sheet and you looked at the bottom of the income statement, they could have suggested to you the bottom line, $955, that you could afford it. But the reality is you can't. And that's why you need the cash flow statement. So the cash flow statement here tells us how cash has moved over a period of time. Again, the balance sheet is telling you how much you're worth, the income statement, what you've earned or spent, and the cash flow statement is how much money you actually have and where it's going. So this cash flow statement involves three parts. Cash flow from operations, which is cash flow related to what you're spending to do your business. Cash flow from investing activities, so it's related to investments. In this particular case, these are the physical assets, the recording equipment you might purchase, but also, for example, if you do investing, bonds or stocks, whatever, that kind of stuff. The last thing here is your cash flow from financing activity. This is typically related to lenders and creditors. It might involve bank loans or startup capital. We won't talk about that so much here, but we'll talk about it more in the workshop. Great. So the cash flow statement. Again, this is defined for a period of time that we're looking at January, starting from January 1st to January 31st. And on January 1st, your grant hadn't come in yet, so you had $0. And then if you're looking at your accounts receivable, you note that you have at least $500 coming in. But sorry, let me start over. You have your net income at $955 that came from your income statement for January, which is what you saw earlier. But because you have $500 in your accounts receivable, you haven't received half that grant yet. That actually means you only received $455 from your operations in January. You have nothing in your investing activities. You haven't bought any equipment yet. No money in your financing activities, so you don't have to worry about that. So your ending cash at the end of the month is $455. Fantastic. Woof, I always do that. I need to not use my keyboard. It's being very annoying. All right, great. So for the next month, just to make it clear, once again, your cash flow statement is defined for a period of time. So in February, you subtract out $45 because that was your net income for February. You weren't making any money. In fact, you were actually losing $45, so you only had to pay out. As a result of that, you have $410 in net cash in operations, no money in cash flow from investing, no money from cash flow in financing activities. And as a result of that, you have $410 at the end of February. Again, we haven't actually talked about our equipment yet, so let's go back to January and let's actually go and buy that equipment. So your equipment in January, back to this $455, your CAPEX for recording equipment is $750. You don't have the cash right now, but let's see what happens if you put it into your statement anyways. And in this case here, 455 minus 750 gives you minus $295. You're short $295. And if you actually bought the equipment, you would be something called cash flow insolvent. You're not quite bankrupt. Bankruptcy is actually when your liabilities exceed your assets, you can't pay out what you owe. But in this particular case here, it's not that you actually can't pay it out. As we saw earlier, you were worth $955 at the end of January. So you're actually cash flow insolvent. You just don't have the money to pay out right now. You need more cash. But the really big question here, and if you're smart, you kind of already should be thinking about this, is $295 actually enough? Well, you should head over to the workshop to find out more, because that's where we're going to cover the rest of this. And it'll be a lot of fun. And at the very end of that workshop, I'll also show you exactly how, or a toy example of how Raw Talk actually goes about doing its finances and bookkeeping and stuff like that. So come visit me over there. And yeah, I guess, do we have time to take questions? Nope, it looks like we're over time. So I'm going to head back. And I'll see you guys later in the workshop. I think we're going to wrap up with our closing ceremonies now.